Welcome everyone, I'm Steve Fletcher. I'm here on Wurundjeri country. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past and present and emerging leaders, and we're doing a little session now on, it's called Let Us Dream. It's being taken from Pope Francis's book of reflections during the COVID lockdown in Rome. The background to this little reflection is that in Easter 2020 he gave a number of interviews online, and he also started doing some writings during the COVID crisis. Eventually this went out to thousands and tens of thousands of people. I think Pope Francis was very aware that this was a crisis for humanity, and the world faced a turning point, a time of trial from which we could come out either better or slide sharply backwards. So in responding to the crisis, Pope Francis asked the question, will we come out better or worse from this crisis? Individually, as a community, as nations. He says, look, some of the responses have been amazing. He calls them martyrs, those who are in healthcare professions and those who are doing volunteer work for the many who are sick and dying throughout the world, and who themselves contracted the virus in the early days and died themselves. On the other side, we see the darkness of humanity and the responses where there was profiteering from pain and desperation. In any crisis, and in particularly this one, there's temptations. One is to be functional and retreat, hide behind our roles, or have very good reasons why we don't allow ourselves to be touched by the suffering and the need of others. Pope Francis looks at the parable of the Samaritan, where the Levi and the priests sort of walk past the man who's beaten up on the side of the road. But the Samaritan, the Good Samaritan, allows himself to be struck by what he sees. He takes up and embraces what the suffering of the other. So the question for us is whether we can kind of embrace the cross of others or our own for a more confident and better life. Do we see ourselves as co-creators in the dynamic work of the Spirit, or are we closed in, living in our own little world and systems? So this retreat and this little reflection perhaps is an ongoing invitation to listen to the Spirit through what we've seen and experienced in our world over these last 2 years. Obviously the effects of COVID are visible on a world scale. But the Pope goes on to talk about that there's pandemics of another kind, of war and starvation and hunger and climate change, which are constantly impacting the world and the planet, but in many ways it's invisible to the broader world. So he says it's time to dream big, to rethink our priorities, what we value and what we want and what we seek, and then commit ourselves to changing those priorities. So the Pope dares us to create something new. You might actually hear in this little reflection, and it's only my pulling out threads of what the Pope talks about in his reflections, I can't help but keep hearing the statement from the heart as I go through these reflections, and I think you'll make the connections too, where the Spirit, the voice of the Spirit seems to be speaking through the Pope's reflection, but already the Spirit's been speaking in this land. And I think the statement from the heart, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders gathered and listened to remember about the spiritual sovereignty of this land, the call for truth-telling in history, the call for a voice and a just agreement recognising truth of this land and of the First Nation people. I think you'll hear that coming or being connected with as we do these reflections on Pope Francis. So he says, Pope Francis says, look, the organising principle as we emerge from this, as we look at our world and a new society, is we can either retreat back into individualism, what he calls a hyper-inflated individualism and self-sufficiency, or we can embrace relationship, responsibility and care for all of creation, for the common good and for the community. He asks, where is God in the crisis? And he uses an image of water, rising water, in a river that bursts its banks. And that's a good image that he uses because he then wants to go on to speak about the overflow of God's mercy, breaking the confines that we've been in, shaking up our roles and our thinking. So in the midst of the crisis, he would say that the overflow is found in the response to suffering, that there's a new courage, a new compassion, a new possibilities for shifting and reimagining the world, and practical ways of transforming suffering. So then he reflects on, well, what have we seen in this time of crisis? We've already spoken, he says, about the different responses. He's saying, look, there's been some disastrous responses to the reality that's before us. This is some of them have been kind of narcissistic. In other words, the news is only good if it's for me personally, and only bad if it's bad for me personally. There's another response of total discouragement, where there's a lament about everyone and everything that leads to a sadness in the spiritual life. It's kind of like a worm that gnaws away inside of you. You have no hope for the future. A sort of pessimism that shuts the door on the future and new things that it could hold. A door that we refuse to open because we might actually find something new. He says, look, COVID has uncovered some realities, some hard realities that we need to face. He says, at times when we've been asked to social distance, when you looked out into the world, how do refugees in a refugee camp social distance? How do children, where education is already a great problem, getting there and accessing education, to not be educated in a pandemic, and the disastrous effects that has on children who can't be educated, and hunger, just simple starvation that people face each day. And he uses the example of Yemen. He said the virus can breed an indifference, a bit like, and he draws on Luke's gospel about the poor man at Lazarus' door, that he steps over him every day saying, it's not my problem. It's a kind of so whatism, a sort of armour plating of the soul where things bounce off and we get used to indifference and suffering all around us. But then he turns and he says, God is never indifferent. God's essence is mercy, and God's steadfast love endures forever, and the dignity and the value of life is upheld over and above economics and money. He turns his eyes to a number of incidences that happened in the world during the time of COVID, which brought up kind of memories from the past and history, and he reflects for a moment on how we kind of responded to history and to memories from the past. He says, free people are a people who remember the past, the good and the bad, and they don't try and purify the past by cancelling it out. He says, amputating the past can make us lose our memory, and also projecting onto the past the history that we would like now, sort of trying to clean it up or wash it clean of all those painful things. He says, remembering the past, we must remember the good and the bad. He refers to Deuteronomy 26, where there's a story of shame and redemption of the people of God. The negativity often of the past, the pain of the past, is also a way of remembering the greatness of the souls of people who have been repressed. If we think in our own country here in Australia, the heroes and saints of Aboriginal and Torres Strait people who were very much in the front lines of advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island rights, Eddie Mabo, William Cooper, Mum Sherrill, William Barrick, Vincent Lanari, Doug Nichols, just to mention a few. They were able to galvanise us, make us look at the past and the truth of the past, and look for ways that we can move into a better future. Again, this comes from something of resonates with the Uluru Statement from the Heart, where one of the last lines of that Statement of the Heart talks about that we can together move into a better future, or make a better future. Pope Francis says, look, even when we look into the genealogy of Jesus, when we go back into his ancestral line, from an earthly perspective, the scriptures don't try and expunge the difficult and shameful parts of the past or ancestry of Jesus. It's all part of who we are. A really powerful theme that weaves its way all the way through this reflection of Pope Francis as we dream for a better future is the recognition of creation, the relationship with creation, the gift of creation. God says that all creation is good, it's bountiful, it's life-giving, and it's beautiful. And beauty is the entryway, as he says, into a new openness and ecological awareness, care and respect of creation. Damage to the planet stems from a loss of gratitude and respect. You know, for centuries, Indigenous people have been trying to talk to non-Indigenous people, particularly in this country, about connection to land. It's really hard for us to get hold of, to understand that land from an Indigenous worldview it's about relationship, a familial relationship, an emotional relationship, a heartfelt relationship, a spiritual relationship, connection with country through language and kinship and ceremonies and culture. This comes out in Pope Francis's reflections too, when he refers to the Synod of the Amazon, which was a 3-week special assembly with the Synod of Bishops for the Pan-Amazonian region. And at the end they wrote, he concluded with the Amazonian New Paths for the Church and in Integral Theology in 2019. And this document emphasised the harmony and unity of humanity and nature, inseparably bound up in a common home. Again, we hear the resonating of the Indigenous worldview. The land is familial, spiritual, emotional communion. People will say, it's me. I am the land and the land is in me. It's an awareness, it's an ecological awareness, the Pope says. It's not an ideology. So, for instance, his earlier document, Laudate Si, wasn't a green encyclical, he says. It was a social encyclical. It's about looking at humanity, which is getting sicker, along with our common home, the environment and creation. That are intertwined. As the planet becomes sick, so does humanity. He gives really simple examples like the fishermen who he's spoken to, as Pope Francis does, where they talk about that they're drawing up tons and tons of plastic as they fish in the ocean each year. So it's an acknowledgement of our creaturehood. We are part of God's creation. We respect God, creation, and one another. The sin is the exploiting that which must not be exploited, the rejection of the limits of love, or what that love requires, these limits. So we know even something very, very recent, the blasting of Dukin Gorge, which had Aboriginal shelters dating back 46,000 years. Now these sites had deep historical and cultural significance and caused real visceral pain to the traditional owners of that place, the Putu Konti Karama people, they felt deeply distressed because of this deep connection with place and creation and home and kinship and stories. So the Spirit is speaking through the land. Denise Champion, in her book, Yata Wanatha, talks about that the land speaks to us. The Spirit speaks through the land. Pope Francis moves from that broader world experience of COVID and the world being stopped by this virus, by this crisis, and then he moves to personalise it. He talks about our own personal COVID. His personal COVID actually gives 3 incidents in his life, and he relates COVID and personal COVID to stoppages, because our lives were stopped in many ways. There were lockdowns. The world, in many ways, where they could, tried to lock down or change. So it was a time to take stock, sifting through the past, remembering with gratitude who we are, what we've been given, and where we've gone astray. Each of us, during a stoppage, during a crisis in our life, each of us comes in touch with our own particular vulnerability, our illnesses, our failures in relationships, our financial loss and failure, our disappointments and betrayals perhaps that we've been to. Lockdowns can create tensions and reveal what's really in our hearts. So once we've identified those things that we want to change or we realise need to change in our lives, that kind of sense of lack of internal freedom, or maybe particular things that overtaken our lives, what you might call kind of like idols, things that become the centre of our lives but aren't really serving me for the good or for others, and even relationships we've neglected. When we kind of address those things, when we see what that needs to change, the Pope then talks about the greatest fruit of his personal COVID was patience. And he kind of humorously talks about how in the midst of it, sometimes we have to develop something of a sense of humour, a kind of lightness of heart that the Spirit can bring even in the midst of difficulty, which makes space for change to happen in our lives. Then he draws on kind of biblical examples of stoppages in the Bible, like St. Paul's conversion, King David, who was, unfaithful in his marriage and was caught in adultery, and then to cover that up, he murdered a friend, and then he repented, got up again, and then he was hit with his own second personal COVID. He had to flee from his son Absalom, who also wanted to kill him and take over the throne. So these crises in our lives, these stoppages in our lives, these things that often are hard and we suffer through, are times of purification. Sometimes they purify us of arrogance or shame, to turning back and trusting in God. Perhaps we've become self-sufficient. Perhaps we've felt very distant from God, and there can be an opportunity for us to sort of open up and even ask the question, where are you, God, in the midst of this crisis? Pope Francis again looks at other biblical characters like Solomon and Samson, who were both given great gifts of wisdom and strength, but it ends badly because they didn't honour those gifts that were given. They turned them in on themselves, and it became self-serving rather than used for others. A stoppage also, a crisis, can rescue us from a worldliness, a kind of self-focus, a self-sufficiency. In this little reflection, Pope Francis really invites us to look at our own personal COVIDs and try and get in touch with those in our lives and work it out how we've approached them, what we've got out of them in the sense of, what do we realise by ourselves that we need to change, and what do we see as the fruit that we'd like, or perhaps as we reflect back in like a situation like this on the retreat, that there has been fruit, even though it was quite difficult, even though there was hardship and suffering. So he would say that his personal kind of fruit was purification. It brought greater understanding, greater tolerance, an ability to forgive, and a fresh empathy for the powerless. He says that this patience, it sort of really came after it was a kind of time of harsh pruning in his life. He was moved. I won't go into the full story here. It's in his book, but he was moved from one of his appointments. And he would say that he was very strong in his leadership, probably a little bit rigid, probably a little bit hard, and he's moved into a more remote time where he was quite alone at times, and this was a real pruning for him. So just like the image that we have for this retreat, you know, sometimes the branches on the vine are pruned, and that can seem harsh at times. And in the midst of that difficulty and suffering, there's also, the Pope talks about this, the activity of the bad spirit in the pruning. That while the pruning might be good and we get rid of kind of bad habits, when the crisis passes, there can be a temptation, he says, for us to feel that things are all right again now. And, you know, he uses that imagery from the Bible about the devil who swept out of the house and then comes back and finds it swept and clean. And he puts it in an amusing sort of way. He says, and the devil will say, in a very polite way, say, "May I come back in?" Doesn't matter how polite the devil is, he comes in, he takes over again. So, though we may suffer a lot through our own personal COVID, it's a kind of grace of God to allow it to change us so we can come out better. Just as long as he says we don't dig in, by that he means returning to perhaps old and exploitive ways that damage relationship with God, with others, and with creation. So perhaps we could take just a few moments to reflect on our own personal COVID, if you like, our own personal stoppage, our own personal crisis. It might be just in the last 12 months or 2 years. Just take a few moments to just get in touch with that, how that feels, what that experience is like. Where did I feel I need to change? And is there any fruit that's come from it? So the next kind of section, Pope Francis drills down a little more deeply now into this choice when I'm in the midst of crisis, or as I'm emerging from the crisis, as I recognise perhaps the things that need to change, and perhaps the things that I want to change, or the fruit that that I'm praying or hoping for to come forth in my life. He says it's a time to choose. And he gives a few guidelines as to how we might make our choices, what we might use as principles for choices. And he draws from kind of the social teachings of the church. He says, you know, let our choices be guided by the preferential option for the poor. Put the poor at the centre of our thinking. Think of the common good beyond self, and what would be the good of the community, the good of the society around me. What would I need to change or work for change for the common good? And in the midst of that is the universal destination of goods, not accumulating goods just for myself, but they would be used and given for all, and especially for those who are most in need. Talks about the need for solidarity, a sense of connectedness, standing alongside and empathy with, but also subsidiarity, meaning that, you know, each community, each place has its own means of self-determination and autonomy and governing. It's almost like respecting each culture, each context that people find themselves in as a community. To be able to put these principles in place to make good choices, he talks about the need for discernment of spirits. So he's saying as we make these choices for a better future, we need to develop the art of discernment and discernment of spirits. He says this is key to a better future. And it's learning to live with what he calls unfinished thinking. In other words, not having it all tied up and boxed up and being absolutely certain about anything. He says it requires a developing of thought which will only take us so far. Then in humility we give space to be open to the Holy Spirit and to listen. So it's not just a kind of a head exercise, an intellectual exercise, but it's opening up my mind and my spirit and recognizing the need to listen to the Spirit in the midst of my thinking and growing in understanding and in my desiring to want things to change and for a better future. So the Spirit shows us new things. Often what the Church talks about, in the Vatican Council, about reading the signs of the times. So interpreting and praying over events in the light of the Gospels helps us to detect the values of God's kingdom and those that aren't of God's kingdom, the opposite of that. And often it's from the margins, the cry for righteousness and justice can be heard, and it's often the call and the voice of the Spirit. So he just gave us a simple example, like the elderly are often so isolated in many cultures, especially in Western cultures, and the neglect and exclusion of the elderly in many ways cuts us as a society, as a culture, off from our roots, our source, and our sustenance. So finding where God's mercy is waiting to overflow and work through people of goodwill will help us to make the necessary changes. Then he goes into a kind of quite a exercise of distinguishing, gives some points about how do I distinguish the voice of God, the good Spirit, and how do I cut away the voice or the movement of the bad spirit. He says that the voice of God never imposes but proposes, versus the bad spirit, which is kind of strident and insistent and pushy and even monotonous. The voice of God, he says, might correct us, but with gentleness and encouragement, even consoling and giving hope. Whereas the bad spirit will often come in and with these sort of dazzling illusions and tempting sensations, but they're all fleeting. They just blow away. They exploit our fears and our suspicions. They seduce us with wealth and prestige. And if we choose to ignore them, then it accuses us and tells us you're worthless. Whereas the voice of God speaks to the present, helping us to move ahead with the here and now. God asks, what is good for me and what is good for us? Whereas the bad spirit distracts us from the present and focuses us on fears of the future or sadness of the past. The voice of God opens us up to new horizons, whereas the bad spirit tries to control us, and the Pope kind of talks about this expression, and pin us to the wall. The good spirit gives hope, whereas the bad spirit sows suspicion and anxiety and finger pointing. The good spirit appeals to my desire to do good, to help and to serve, and gives strength to go forward on the right path. Whereas the bad spirit closes me in on myself, makes me rigid and intolerant, and a spirit of fear and grievance makes me sad and fearful and irritable. So learning to distinguish the two kinds of voices allows us to choose the right path. And that path isn't always the most obvious one, but certainly helps us to avoid making decisions while we're trapped in past hurts or fears of the future. So let's just take a few moments, perhaps, to pray right now, just as the Pope said, when we haven't got it all worked out, we don't understand everything, to call upon the Holy Spirit in humility. We might just call upon the Holy Spirit now, just where we are, and just ask the Spirit to grace us, to gift us with discernment of spirits, to know, the voice of God and be able to distinguish the voice of the bad spirit, the one who comes to deceive and rob and steal and upset and rob us of hope about a better future. So let's just take a few moments just to, in your own way, just to call upon the Spirit, just to pray for that grace to be able to discern and to hear and long and desire to listen to the voice of the Spirit, to the voice of God. For the Pope, a sign of hope, a fruit, if you like, of the crisis of COVID, he talks about is the incredible witness of women in leadership roles who are on the front lines in healthcare. He talks about that over 70% of those involved in healthcare and ministering in many ways amongst COVID sufferers were women, and many who were unpaid, many who were working in sectors that there was no monetary contribution at all. And he refers to the whole kind of faithfulness of women, the discipleship of women, the faithful disciples who went to the cross with Jesus and were there at the resurrection. Really beautiful section in his reflection. Then he swings again into the Amazonian Synod, talking about this amazing breakthrough that he feels happened during that synod, and perhaps a great breakthrough for the church, and really important perhaps for this time in Australia and certainly in our retreat here. He says that the breakthrough was this clear vision and mission to stand with Indigenous people, the poor and the land, to defend culture and creation against forces of death and destruction that were driven by profit. Perhaps we might even call it the old evil of colonialism. He talked about the vitality of that Indigenous leadership, and particularly lay leadership. He said that the Amazon Synod was yet another expression of the overflow. Remember, we talked about the overflow, that new movement of the Spirit. He talked about that synod re-established an ancient practice of synodality, of walking together. Sounding familiar? The statement of the heart. We need to do this together, walk this together. Goes back to the early church practice. When the apostles were wrestling with issues that divided them, they lived with those tensions and disagreements, but they didn't sever the relationship. They didn't just walk away from one another. They learned to mature in the differences and come to agreements. They accepted the diversity amidst mutual listening. So he's kind of saying that this synodality is a whole new beginning, a new way of listening and hearing the people of God. Finally, Pope Francis breaks open what it means to be a people. It means we're made up of a history, a language, culture, memories, collective wisdom. You can see here that the world view of Indigenous people is shaping the way Pope Francis is seeing a better future. And he talks about recovering what it means to be a people. Yes, it can be through shared hardship and struggle and a common call to a better future. But it's the soul of the people that unites us. Maybe what Indigenous people talk about in terms of the spirit of the land in us and we in the land. There are key moments that impress deeply on the soul of a people. And maybe in Australia, amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it's something like the 1960 referendum, or land rights, or freedom rights, the tent embassy, the Mabo decision, native title, the apology. But they're kind of more on a national scale, but then there are local stories and dreams and visions and land right cases that impress deeply upon the soul of a people. A people can only be approached through intuition, by entering into its spirit, its heart, entering into its history, the stories and memories and the impact that has as people tell that history and story. So the dignity of a people comes from the soul, the closeness of God, the Creator Spirit. God was close to the people, the chosen people in the Scriptures, to Abraham. There was this covenant, was a great source of dignity for the Jewish people. living that closeness to God brought a dignity and nobility of soul and brought forth strong institutions. But when the covenant was broken, the people lost a sense of their awareness and closeness of God, and their sense of being a people started to disintegrate. We know then that Jesus is the fullness of the closeness of God, that Jesus is the anointed one from whom salvation comes, but within each one's own culture. The Pope goes on and makes this incredible statement about that salvation will come from the people. What he means by that is that it will come out of their context. That Jesus, we often talk about it, when Jesus became human, came amongst us, revealed the closeness of God, he came into a culture, into a particular place, into a particular time. And that's the way Christianity grew. But when it became caught up with imperialism and with kind of this colonialism, when it got caught up with power, the gospel kind of got covered over and it couldn't be heard in the same way, rising out of the soil and the context of the culture in which it was being brought to. Pope Francis says that one of the ways Christianity has gone astray is to forget we belong to a people, that salvation comes from the people, out of their context. So people discover the gospel, they discover Jesus in their context, as the message is brought to them. That they discover that in their own context and culture. And isn't it amazing that as you listen to Aboriginal people, some of those old people, when they talk about when the missionaries first came, that they weren't surprised by the gospel message and the gospel values. It kind of already spoke into what already the Spirit was doing and preparing them in the land. So the Pope talks about this, that we're not saved by an idea, we're saved by an encounter, a personal encounter with Jesus. He talks again, he uses that whole kind of sense that because we're all isolated in COVID, he says, it's the face of another that awakens our best self. It's the face of Jesus. It's the gaze of Jesus that draws out the best in ourselves. So the pandemic reminds us that no one is saved alone. We have a shared destination. We need to discover what belonging to a people means in the midst of an atomized society, which he says an atomized society, they're broken up into little units and we're all individual and all separated from one another and there's no connection. He says is never at peace with itself, and it always fails to see the social effects of inequality. He says fraternity, brotherhood, sisterhood, community is the new frontier. He says fraternity and solidarity are the better way to a better future out of this crisis, because it makes space at the table for everyone. A place at the table does not mean crumbs from the table. It means we sit equally together at the table of the Lord.